Hello. When I speak, there's an American expression as off the cuff. That's in the old days where people wore white shirts with cufflinks and they might write on the cuff of their shirt a couple of little short notes. And they speak off the cuff. This is my cuff right here. I think there's about 8 words on that page, and that's what I'm going to talk about. And I wrote it down so I sort of know the order that I want to go at things. That's all. First, very briefly about me. And being an American, it's very hard for me to keep that short, as you probably know about Americans. Anyway, I think I've done a pretty good job of becoming a Tasmanian. I've been here for a lot of years. About me, I was set off on a mission this lifetime to learn about how to be healthy. And what set me off on it was that my very progressive mother, before I was born in 1942, I happen to be 80 years old right now, I'll be 81 next month. My mother went to a pediatrician, a doctor specializing in children, and he informed her that feeding a baby on human breast milk was not really a very good idea, that the modern formulas were much better. And so from day one, I have been made into a sugar addict. As you know, most baby formulas have a majority of sugar. So I didn't have very good nutrition, and I had health problems, and I won't bore you with them. But I had to try to overcome them over the years. And I discovered after a while that what I ate had a whole lot more to do with how I felt than any medication that I took or anything that the doctor could do for me. And I gradually came to the point where I decided that food was my best medicine, and that doctors were extremely dangerous people who should be avoided at all costs whenever possible. So I do that. And I was led up some blind alleys, and the biggest one was I started gardening with a belief in the organic gardening and farming movement as a religion. It is a religion, you know. And it even has rabbis. By the way, I'm a Christian, but I'm also a Jew. And I started out this lifetime as a Jew, and I didn't become a Christian until about 5 years ago when I met a bunch of Mennonites here and found out what it's all about. But in any case, I spent some time in Israel. In fact, I spent 9 weeks volunteering in the Israeli army on a base as a civilian volunteer, helping out. And this was a long time ago, like 1987. And naturally, I was on the base. My fate, I was on the base that supplied the entire Israeli army with food. And the base was descended upon all the time with rabbis. And because the Israeli army eats kosher food. And I found out that the rabbinate in Israel makes 90% of their income by supervising the kosher food business. Only 10% from conducting weddings and funerals and teaching children and the things you would imagine religious leaders would do. Anyway, I don't see the organic farming movement as very different than kosher food. It has a bunch of rigid rules, and there's some sense in some of them, and some of them are just ideological and don't really make any sense. But I believed in it. And I mistakenly believed that I could create a garden of Eden out of any old clay pit or gravel heap if I just put enough compost into the ground. Any of you believe that? Nobody's going to raise their hand. I see you all, by the way. That's very good. I'm looking at you. I'm trying to be in that room as best I can be. Anyway, I came to a point in my life where I decided that I would be much happier if I didn't focus on making money and instead focused on having as much free time as possible and being as self-sufficient as I could be and making as little cash as I possibly could bother to make. So we sold everything in Los Angeles. We sold a business, and we went and bought 5 acres of useless land in Western Oregon and didn't realize how useless it was or how destroyed it had already been and how little nutrients there were left in there. It was green, it was pretty. I was from the city, I didn't know any better. And I started to grow my own food on it. There was plenty of organic matter available. There was a huge stable just a few miles away, and I could take home a ute load of what they called horse manure as much as I wanted for no charge. All I had to do was shovel it up and take it away. So I did. And I grew my food mostly with that. A couple of years later, I found myself in the seed business without any money to speak of, not knowing how to run the seed business, having gone through the savings that I brought with me. I was in a position where I had to live for a whole year on about $4,000 savings. And the reason that I could do that was I had a huge trials ground. I was an honest seedsman. I didn't sell things that I didn't know what they were. I actually had to grow them first and look at them before I could tell you what they did. And I compared lots of different varieties to see what was adapted, what tasted best, what was easiest to grow, which had other characteristics that were good for the home gardener. So my seed company did really well, but not in the first 2 years. I didn't know how to run the business and I didn't have enough capital. So I had to eke out a meager living. In the second year, I lived on $4,000 too, because I made more than that. I made $7,000. But I put 3,000 in the bank because I lived the previous year on 4. I knew I could do another year on 4. It got me to town at least once a month. I could shop in the Salvation Army. I didn't need very much stuff. I had lots of food. I had a lady friend at that time named Isabel. She was my doctor. She ran something called the Great Oak School of Health. She was a naturopath. I mentioned to Isabel my financial problems, and she said, "Oh, it's a blessing." She said, "You got this half-acre trial grounds full of vegetables, and you just look at them, cut them, throw them on the ground, and let them rot mostly. Why don't you just go on a vegetable diet and just eat 95% vegetables? You'll just get healthier. It's good for you." So I did. And a couple of years later, Isabel, in the middle of the summer, came and knocked on my door unexpectedly and let me know how she felt about me and moved in with me and sold the Great Oak School of Health and retired and busied herself running triathlons and riding her bicycle and seeing a few clients now and then. She ate my vegetables. And we both ate my vegetables. And we lost our health. Isabel's hair started to fall out. Her fingernails got weak and broke. My teeth started to get loose in my jaw. And that was the beginning of my loss of teeth. Now, it wasn't all from eating organically grown vegetables. I had very bad nutrition as a child. I already had trouble with my teeth. I'd already lost some bone. But anyway, it just accelerated on this diet. Then Isabel and I went to Fiji and we started accidentally eating really good food. We took a sabbatical and our health came back and got really fit. And this food all came from a place called the Sigatoka Valley in the island of Viti Levu, about an hour's drive from the capital, Suva. And almost all the vegetables in the Central Produce Market came from there. The vegetables tasted really good. On those vegetables, Isabel's hair got shiny, her fingernails got hard, our energy got good. We weren't stressed out anymore. My teeth tightened up in my jaw and we felt wonderful. And I inquired, I went out there, actually visited the valley. And I found out that nobody had ever used any fertilizer in that valley ever. And nobody had ever used any manure or compost in that valley ever, either. It was sort of like the Nile River. The Sigatoka River flooded every few years when there was a cyclone. It dumped a lot of silt on the ground. That silt was super mineralized because the rocks in the watershed were very, very highly mineralized volcanic rocks. And then the weeds took over the fields for 5 months a year in the hot rainy season and produced an enormous amount of biomass. They couldn't grow vegetables anyway. It was too hot and humid and they all got diseased and died. And then when the weather settled, they plowed that organic matter in and grew vegetable crops. And they've been doing that for 75 years when I went there in 1984. Amazing. And those vegetables, and they were sprayed with pesticides. They weren't organic. Not only were they not fertilized, they're not composted and not manured, but they were chemical, not with fertilizer. Anyway, and we got better. And I concluded that, first of all, traces of chemical pesticides are really not a problem to a body that has really good nutrition. And second part of that is, if you grow food that has a lot of nutrition in it, you almost never need to use pesticides. So, anyway, that experience made me realize that what I had acquired and believed from the organic farming movement was wrong. And I didn't know what was right, but I knew that that wasn't right, that there was missing pieces, wrong pieces, I didn't know what. So I started doing research, and we sold the seed business. It got to be an enormous business. I was able to retire at the age of 44. And the reason I could do that is I lived for a couple of years on $4,000 a year. And I've learned that I don't really need very much money if I have a big garden, and I don't have much I want to buy that costs money. So I've been able to live rather simply. I call it independently poor. I do the same things rich people do. I have my investments, but we don't have a lot of spending money, but it's there. So I haven't had to make money since I was 44 years old, although I do sometimes. I get book royalties or one thing or another comes along. But anyway, I started looking into how to grow more nutrient-dense food, and eventually I found out how. And I'm going to tell you, but not right away. First, I have something else to tell you. And that's maybe more important. And that's why I'm going to tell you first. I want to tell you why you want to grow nutrient-dense food. You see, if I can create a desire in you that is strong, then you will do what's necessary to get it. If it's just a vague idea, nutrient-dense food is a nice thing to have, I kind of like it, but it's inconvenient. I'll just go to Woolies and buy something, brother. That isn't going to change your life. So I want to, if I possibly can, without taking too much time, inspire you to want to eat more nutrient-dense food. I suppose the best way to start is to introduce you to a book. And I think that this is one of the most important books that was written in the 20th century, and it's not known to very many people. It's called Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, and the author's name is Weston Price. Anybody in the audience in that room ever hear of him? Stick up a hand if you did. Nobody. Oh, okay. It's amazing how things like that can be moved into obscurity where it just disappears. What Price told us is not convenient to the establishment. It does not forward the medical industry, the drugging industry, the doctor industry, the hospital industry, none of that, okay? It's the opposite of it. Here's Price's story in very brief. Price was a research dentist. His interest was preventative dentistry. What can be done to make it so that people don't need a dentist? He failed completely. He was very famous. He had a high position at the University of Ohio in Cleveland. He was known all over the United States, probably all over the English-speaking world. He published papers. He did all kinds of research. He completely failed. At the end of his career, he admitted it. He said, the reason I can't come up with any answers is I don't have a control group. When you do animal research, you've got to have a group of animals that are normal, and then you do something different with part of them and see what happens to the part you did something different with, and then you could say something that means something. But when you find the odd human being from some small town who's got perfect teeth at the age of 90 and has eaten nothing but candy all their life, why? You see? So nobody can report to you really what they really eat. You can't believe what people tell you when you say, what do you eat every day? They forget. Or they make it look better. Anyway, so Price discovered in his career that there were some very remote human communities in the 1930s that were so remote that to reach them, you had to journey for days. And they were so far from civilization that they didn't have a shop. And nobody had access to sugar, white flour, sardines, Spam, tea bags, any of that stuff. Okay, they didn't have much money, I don't imagine, in these places either. Who knows? Maybe they go and find a few gold nuggets in the stream, and go to town with them and buy some fish hooks. I don't know what they did, but anyway, these people live very simply. So Price, with his connections in public health, organized trips into these places, and he was taken in there by public health authorities, and he visited these people, and he took a lot of photographs, and he looked in everybody's mouth in the village, and he counted the decay in every mouth. By the way, generally, he found no tooth decay in anybody's mouth. And if anybody had lost any teeth, it was because they played sports. And the old people's teeth were all tight in their jaw. But that's not the end of it. The average age in these villages was a lot higher than most people. They had an average lifespan well into the 80s in most of them, some longer than that. There was no knowledge of heart disease, diabetes, cancer, none of the stuff that we have. Okay. These people were healthy. And when they got really old, they caught pneumonia and they died. It was a really good life. Okay? They had good vigor. They seemed to be very clear-headed. They seemed to Price to be more intelligent than the people in the cities, and more poised. The thing of it is that he found groups of people like this in Switzerland, eating rye bread and cheese and dairy products and strawberries in the summer, maybe a few apples. These are really remote valleys and fairly high elevation. He found people living on the Outer Hebrides, on the island of Harris. In those days, they didn't get much from the mainland. They lived on fish and kale and seaweed and the stuff they could take out of the ocean, and little veggie gardens that they could only grow veggies that tolerated, very poor soil and very cold, windy conditions. Probably they grew a bit of kale, anyway, they're incredibly healthy. He found people living on Polynesian islands who ate starchy root crops and seafoods. He found Australian Aboriginals. He came to Australia in the 1930s. There's photographs of Aboriginal people in Australia who are very long-lived, who have perfect health and perfect teeth. Of course, they're living on bush tucker. They're too far away from anywhere to buy anything. He found them in the Tiwi Islands. He found them in remote islands in Fiji. He found them on the west coast of South America, living at the mouths of rivers coming down out of the Andes, where they fished and gardened. He found them in northern Canada, mostly eating animal foods, mostly. He found a woman in northern Canada who had had 17 children, and she still had all of her teeth. Did that impress you, ladies? It should have. Anyway, he sort of discovered the potential we have for being healthy if we have proper nutrition. And I take another lesson from Weston Price, and that is there is no one diet that's right for human beings. Every one of these groups ate very different diets. Some of them ate a lot of carbohydrates. He found very healthy people in Africa eating tropical root crops. Some of them ate mostly meat. Some of them ate a lot of green vegetables. Some of them, the Aboriginals, what did they eat? Everything that you could just about digest. My take on this is that when a wandering group of humans comes into a brand new place and they've never been there before, that place has a certain potential for growing food. There's a limited range of foods that you can grow or find there. And your mob that comes in there has a varied gene pool, and there are going to be some people in your group that are sensitive to some of those foods, who can't digest some of those foods very well. And they or their children who have those genes are going to die of childhood diseases. And they tend to breed themselves out of the gene pool. So after a few generations, you've got a community that is now adapted genetically to the food possibilities that it has. And they also study the food possibilities, and they learn over time that this particular food is good for pregnant women, and this particular food heals this kind of disease, and so forth. And these foods tend to make more health, so they concentrate on the good stuff. And one of the things that Price noticed about these communities is they seem to have a birth rate that's under control. Their population isn't wildly expanding, so they're not stressed out from having lack of resources. I have a guess about this. I'm not sure. But I think that healthy human beings are not as interested in sex. Think about that. Not that they aren't interested, but they don't need to do it. They feel great, you know, they feel fine. Uh, it's not a drug. Okay, for a lot of people, sex is a drug. So anyhow, um, I'd like you to read Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. Uh, it's available for free download online at the Soil and Health Library. Maybe Emily will post that later, the URL of the Soil and Health Library. I may as well mention quickly how that happened. My wife Isabel had cancer when she was 26, and she made it go away, and then by herself. And then she got cancer again when she was 37. She was running the Great Oak School of Health, and she had 3 women in residence with breast cancer. And there was a lot of hostility between the family of one of those women, almost involved cops and charges filed for, you know, practicing medicine without a license and stuff like that. Anyway, with all this stress, Isabel came down with breast cancer again at age 37, and she went on a long water fast and did various things and made it go away. And then in her mid-50s, Isabel and I sold up and we moved to Canada. And this was very stressful, and we started eating out of the supermarket, and all these things combined, and Isabel's cancer came back, and she couldn't defeat it this time, and she died. I did something after that to try to keep myself out of the bourbon bottle. I drank an awful lot of bourbon for about 6 months after Isabel died. Anyway, Isabel and I tried to write a book, which is also available for free download on the Soil and Health Library. It's called How and When to Be Your Own Doctor. And it explains sort of holistic medicine from a hygienic point of view, where your most powerful medicine is water and water fasting and various kinds of detoxification. Anyway, she got weary of having people wanting to come and stay with her and fast and all that stuff. So we wrote this book. Maybe we could sell them a book when we told them, no, we're not taking in patients anymore. And I put that book for free download online and created something called the Soil and Health Library to put it therein. And then it occurred to me, there's a lot of other old public domain books on my bookshelf about agriculture and health. And so I started putting them online. So now there's several hundred books for free download in the Soil and Health Library. And some of it involves agriculture, and some of it involves various kinds of medicine and health, and a few other minor topics that I'm interested in. And anyhow, you can go there and read Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. You can read William Albrecht's book, which I'm going to mention in a minute. You can read How and When to Be Your Own Doctor. You could look at the list of books and find a lot of interesting things there. You open your eyes to a lot of possibilities. Anyway, if you start out, I guess the bottom line on health about why to, I'd like to wrap this up. I've been talking about it almost a half an hour now, and that's enough. Why do you want to eat nutrient-dense food? Well, first of all, you'll feel a lot better. And the inflammation level of your body will go way down, and your aches and pains will reduce enormously, and you'll be more comfortable, and you'll sleep better. And your arthritis will go away, and a whole lot of things the doctor's giving you medication will go away if you'll stop taking his medication. I don't know if anybody in the room got that joke. Doctor's medication makes you sick, you know. There's almost nothing that the doctor gives you that if you took a big bottle of it wouldn't kill you right away. So anyway, that's kind of been my career, I guess you might say. And since I retired, I've been spending most of my time trying to teach people how to get along better and do what I can for you. So if you look at Weston Price's book, you'll see that there's about 100 photographs in there. If you did nothing but look at the photographs and read the captions of the 100 photographs, you would get 85% of the message. One of the things those photographs show is that when a baby starts out on nutrient-dense food, which means that its mother was on nutrient-dense food for her whole life, so that the body that the mother built has adequate reserves of nutrition in it, because her body had already accumulated them to create this healthy young body. And then, that baby is fed on nutrient-dense food all of its life. It's going to have a longer lifespan, considerably. Now, this is speculation, but I think the potential lifespan for the average human being is probably 110 years. And to achieve that, however, as a group, we'd have to have at least 3 generations of perfect feeding behind us before we got to that. And each generation would have a somewhat longer lifespan than the previous one, as we built up our nutritional reserves. So that after 3 generations of perfect feeding, and by the way, that doesn't involve the men very much, it involves the women. So if we had 3 generations of good feeding on the maternal line, the babies would all have very wide faces. They'd all have perfectly straight teeth. There'd be no crooked teeth. Their nose would be spread out across their face. Their cheekbones would be far apart. Their eyes would be large. They'd be a lot more than 2 fingers above the eyebrows, which is a way of saying in Spanish that they narrow between the eyes. You know, if somebody's 2 fingers above the eyebrows, they don't have a brain capacity up there. There's no skull room. You see, it's a way of, it's a derogatory saying. He hasn't got 2 fingers above the eyebrows. Anyway, we would look really healthy. We would be sturdy. We would have strong bones. Those kids wouldn't have sickness. They wouldn't die of childhood disease. The infant mortality rate would be just about 0. Oh, and the death and childbirth rate in those communities, about 0. So those communities, you see, they didn't have to have 11 or 12 children to have 2.3 of them to survive to maintain the population and have the rest of them die, you know, in childhood, which was the way it often was in places. In those communities, all the children lived. All the children were healthy. All the women survived childbirth. Okay. Anyway, we could have that. And once we got that going on, we could get rid of most of the doctors, most of the dentists, most of the hospitals, most of the drugging companies, most of the huge expense and burden on us. And I don't mean just in money. I'm talking about pain and suffering, you see. And we could do so much better. All we have to do to achieve a lot of that would be to simply grow the basic commodity staples that we eat so that they were nutrient dense. We could then make junk food out of it. We could, as long as we didn't make white flour out of it. If we just used the whole foods, we could make all kinds of prepackaged dried foods that were degraded in one way or another. We'd still be really healthy. So, and we wouldn't have to be worrying about what we were eating either. We just could eat pretty much whatever we wanted. And if it didn't make us sick to our stomach, we'd be healthy on it. But anyway, I'd like to see that. And the reason I'd like to see us have an average lifespan of 110 years is because I've gotten smarter as I've gotten older. Some of us don't. You know, if you're dishonest with yourself and you lie to yourself and you're living a life of fraud and deception, you'll get stupider as you get older. But if you're honest, you will grow. And I've heard that there's a place, it's called Okinawa, where they eat a lot of seafood and live rather simply. And they have an awful lot of people on Okinawa and the smaller islands around it that are over 100 years old. And these people are considered national treasures. And everyone competes to please get this oldie to come and live in their house and put their feet under your table and contribute to the family just with their wisdom and their experience. They're considered very valuable. But you're not valuable if you're sick and can't think straight and don't feel good. You have to be, alive. Anyhow, I'd like to see all of us like that. I think the world would be a whole lot better if it would be like that. So that's really why I'm doing what I'm doing. And that's why you want to learn about this. Because the way it's set up right now, it's designed to make you sick, to make you helpless, to make you dependent, to lower your intelligence, right? To make you controllable, make you a good slave. And that's not the way I want the world to be. Now, one of the ways that we can get out of this control system we live under is to grow our own food. The more that we can do for ourselves, and the less that we're dependent upon getting money to do things, it has a remarkable effect on human beings. It's really good for us. So you're all gardening. I hope most of you are veggie gardening. I hope most of you come out of this conversation feeling like your vegetable garden isn't near big enough. So that's what I mean about trying to create a desire to grow nutrient-dense food. Okay. Oh, there's one other thing about nutrient-dense food. It tastes so much better. In fact, God designed us to be able to recognize nutrient-dense food when it is in front of us. And you know how we do that? We put it in our mouth and we taste it. It's really simple. What we call taste in food, the natural taste, is its nutrition. What you're tasting is the minerals and the vitamins and the enzymes and, you know, all those biological factors of nutrition. That's the taste. Yeah. So if you want to taste some food that doesn't have any nutrition, just go to Woolies and buy a cauliflower and steam it. And then eat it. And most of the time, it won't taste like anything. Unless you put a bunch of melted cheese on it or something like that. So anyway, nutrient-dense food tastes good all by itself. Doesn't need butter. That's nice with butter, but it doesn't need butter. It doesn't need seasoning. It doesn't need an expert chef. All you need to do is steam it, melt a little butter over it, and eat it. It's really good for it. All right. So how do you do it? This is the question. There's a couple of factors, I guess, that go into allowing plants to develop the kind of nutrient density that they have the genetic potential to do. One of them is soil organic matter, the old organic stuff, the organic method. They weren't entirely wrong. Okay? Organic matter is very important. Modern farming operates in such a way as to lower the organic matter content of soil steadily, and they get down very low. When this happens, the biological activity in the soil also gets proportionately lowered, and the plants then get proportionally less nutrition. You see, a lot of the nutrition that plants uptake is not from minerals dissolved in the water that's in the soil that they're taking in. There is some of that. But a lot of the nutrients that the plants intake are actually very complex organic chemicals that are manufactured by soil biology. They're manufactured by bacteria and they're manufactured by fungi that are living in the root zone of the plant. And they relate to each other. The interaction between the microlife in the soil and the roots of the plant is incredibly complex, and we're learning so much about it. You ought to do some research about it. I can't take the time. You know, you would run out of patience. I was supposed to start out and tell you something. I guess it will come up now. I'd like to tell you all, see my own picture here. I'd like to tell you all this much stuff. Actually, I'd like to tell you all this much stuff with my arms as wide as I can possibly hold them. You know? I have more than that, but I only have time to tell you this much stuff, just a little bit. So I have to try to tell you the most important stuff. And I have a problem with that because I'm 81 years old. I tend to wander a bit and get a bit garrulous. And I'm trying very hard not to forget myself and go off into things that interest me that may not interest you. But anyway, so one of the things we have to do to get more nutrient density in food is we have to increase the organic matter of the soil. But the organic movement tells us that by doing that, we also want to increase the mineralization of the soil and thereby provide the plants with all the nutrients that they need that comes out of the organic matter. And sometimes the organic movement will allow that, well, maybe a bit of ag lime would be appropriate. You get the pH right. But everything else ought to come out of our compost. And if it isn't happening, we're not making good enough compost. Have you heard that sort of thing? Yeah, thank you. This guy in the center there with the gray hair. What's your name? You? Oh, you can't see. I'm pointing. You're wearing a brown jumper and you got a smile. You, that's right. Thank you. I got a feeling you're really listening to me, and I appreciate that. Uh, the um, your soils in Geelong, the soils in southern Victoria, if you were to go out and find a healthy paddock outside of Geelong somewhere that produced, good grass and had healthy animals on it, you'd find that it has an organic matter content of around 4%. If it was heavier soil that had a fair bit of clay in it, it might even be as high as 5.5%. If it was a very light sandy soil, it might be 3.5%. Okay. Now, believe it or not, that's all the organic matter you need. So if you did a little arithmetic and said, what do I have to do to take 100 square meters of ground? And let's assume it has no organic matter in it at all, and I'd like to bring it up to 4%. How much compost do I have to put in it? Well, I'll tell you, about an inch, about 25 millimeter layer dug in once, and you'll be up at 4%, 3.5%, 4%. How much do I have to do to maintain it? Well, every year, some of it rots. And a rough estimate would be 10% of it rots every single year. And let's assuming nothing else is putting any in except the compost that we put in there or the manure. So we have to put in 0.5% more every single year to replace what disappears. How much is that? Well, that's a little layer about 5 mils thick. Is there anybody in this room there capable of spreading 5 mils of compost? I can't do it. It's so thin, it doesn't look like it did anything. But that's all it takes. And now you've got enough biological activity going on in the soil to cover that aspect of plant health. And that much biological activity will also make the soil behave nicely. It'll develop crumbs, the air will go in and out of it, it'll hold a bit more moisture, it creates a good growing medium for the roots to function in. All those benefits of organic matter should happen somewhere around 4 or 5% at most organic matter in most soils. Okay. Unless you got a really heavy clay. And if anybody has a really heavy clay, you have my sympathies. It's very difficult. It can be done. It's very difficult. So if the big distinction here, I guess, is to not try to put the minerals the plant needs in with the compost, but instead to consider them as a separate thing. And to take a look and see what minerals the soil's offering the plant already, and then work out what we would like to see there, and then add it in a way that doesn't disrupt the soil with materials that don't kill all the biology, that are all positive. And now you've got a soil that's got balanced mineral nutrition and a vigorous biological life system going on in it. Then the plants grow like crazy and they taste really good and the insects don't bother them and the diseases don't attack them. And you live a long time and feel great eating them and they taste wonderful. It's that simple, but not quite. Making decent compost is not so easy. I'll bet you that the city of Geelong has some kind of composting operation. I'll bet you go to the landscape yard, you can buy their compost for $50, $60, $70, $80 a cubic meter. Maybe up in Victoria, it's a lot more. I don't know. I know you guys pay outrageous money for firewood. Anybody in there buy firewood? No? Yeah, I pay, what do I pay? I get 6 cubic meters of firewood for $450. I can see that a few people there wish they had that available. I don't want you all to move to Tasmania, though. It's cold down here. It's miserable. You'd be uncomfortable. You wouldn't like it. So don't even think about it. But anyway, the problem with adding minerals is, what do you add? What do you do? You go to the farm supply and there's bags and bags and bags of stuff that have numbers on them, 10, 10, 10, 8, 16, 24. Do you use that sort of stuff? There's bags of potassium sulfate, potassium chloride. There's urea ammonium nitrate, there's monoammonium phosphate, there's ammonium sulfate, there's so many different things. Some of those things are actually rather innocuous and don't hurt the soil or the soil biology. Others of them cause a lot of damage to the soil. Sometimes that damage is very subtle, and you don't notice it. So farmers use these things and then they get sort of addicted to them. They don't realize that it's just like going to the doctor and taking the doctor's medication. You go to the doctor and you complain about your this or that, and the doctor gives you these pills and you take them and it makes the thing feel better, but then you start developing this new problem. And the doctor says, oh, now you have a new disease. Now I'm going to give you another pill. Actually, the first pill is what caused the second problem. And to get rid of the second problem, you just stop taking the first pill. You see, but people don't see that. They get hooked into the system. Well, the same thing happens when you start using the wrong kind of chemicals, especially if you don't put any organic matter back in the soil. And then the plants start having problems with insects and diseases and so forth. And the soil gets hard to work, and it doesn't want to make a good seed bed, and it doesn't hold as much moisture, and it becomes more subject to drought. And all these things happen, and most of the people that are trapped in that system don't realize it. Well, we would have been lost in this muddle, except that there was this remarkable person named William Albrecht. And Albrecht wrote a book. He also wrote hundreds of journal articles and hundreds of health magazine articles. And most of these articles say the same thing over and over and over again. He really only had about 10 or 12 things to tell us. But he just kept saying it at every possible platform that he could get anybody to take it. And towards the end of his life, Albrecht worked out exactly what the mineral balance in the soil would be that would produce the most nutrient density. And the way he did that was he used something called soil testing. And there's different kinds of soil tests, but the more usable ones, this is what they do. They look upon the soil like it's a storage battery of plant nutrients. And they estimate the size of the battery. How many ampere hours of electricity can it hold? How many units of plant minerals can it hold on to, and yet deliver them to the plant when the plant wants them? It's a sort of a storage system. Most of this storage system is done by the clay in the soil. If the soil is some kind of fine sand that's absolutely got no clay in it whatsoever, it has very little ability to hold on to plant nutrients, and they all wash out every time it rains hard. And that kind of soil is hard to build up. And as the soil's clay content goes up, its ability to hold on to plant nutrients increases. Oh, and organic matter. You put compost into the soil, and decomposed organic matter has the ability to hold on to plant nutrients better than clay. So if you build the organic matter, you increase the capacity of the soil to hold on to plant nutrients. There's a name for this. It's a technical word. It's called cation exchange capacity. And I may leave out the word cation and just say exchange capacity for this talk. And I hope you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, Albrecht looked at soils all over the United States. And he did some animal feeding experiments that are really telling. Albrecht was the head of the soils department in the state of Missouri, at the University of Missouri, and he was the department head of soils. He was hated by every other person just about in that business and every other university, because Albrecht was focused on the health of animals and consequently the health of us. They were focused on the profit that the farmer could make. And they did not like what Albrecht was talking about. They especially didn't like it because the main fertilizer that Albrecht was talking about was ag lime. And lime is cheap, and lime is heavy, and lime is a local business. And you can't ship your lime from your quarry for too many hundreds of kilometers before it's just impossible. So there are farms in parts of Australia where there's no convenient limestone, and those farmers are just doing without it best they can. They just can't afford to bring it out to Western South Australia, out in the wheatlands. I know a farmer out there. They just have to make do without it. Anyway, there's no profit in lime. The chemical industry makes no profit in lime. The fertilizer companies make no profit from farmers spreading lime. But when the farmers spread the right amount of lime, then they fill the soil's exchange capacity up with calcium to a certain point, then the soil becomes much more able to deliver plant nutrients to the plants, and it takes much less fertilizer to get the same result. Now, the fertilizer sellers don't want that. They want the farmer buying a lot of their product. So if they can prevent the farmer from spreading ag lime by just saying authoritatively that it doesn't matter, you don't need to bother with it, and the farmer says, okay, and they put out those chemicals and they get a good crop. And after they do that for a few years, they start having disease problems or insect problems or other kinds of problems, you see, but it's never associated with what they're doing to build the soil. It's always, they're a victim. This insect attacked them. This disease attacked them. They don't realize they've created it themselves. Okay. We do the same thing with human health. You go to see the doctor and you say, I've got this problem, and he treats it as though you've been attacked. And his job is to attack it back and kill it. So get rid of it. When actually his job is to get you to realize you've created the disease yourself and get you to change the way you're living so you get better. But anyway, there's no money to be made in doing that. And if your doctor did that, most of you would not go to him. You'd go to some other doctor who'd give you a pill. So anyway, Albrecht, he was trying to figure out what kind of soil makes good health. And he noticed certain things. The first is that the amount of minerals in the soil seems to have a lot to do with how much rainfall there is. And when you've got a piece of land where the rainfall is just barely enough to grow crops, that's where you get the really rich soil. And that's where you get really nutrient-dense crops. And when you get more and more rain, you have lower and lower levels of soil mineralization. And the name for that process is called leaching. The water passing through the soil dissolves plant nutrients and transports them on down and out into the ocean, which is why the ocean is salty. The salt in the ocean was all leached from the soil. Okay? The most leachable thing in the soil is sodium. It sticks on the clay less well than any other plant nutrient. So that's why there's so much sodium in the seawater, because it leaches the most readily. Anyway, the more the soil gets leached, the lower its mineral content gets. Now, I'm going to try to give you a portrait of the United States. I'm sorry, I have to use this example. It's a perfect example. In the United States, if you start on the East Coast, there's a forest. When the first settlers landed in the United States, it wasn't the United States, a squirrel could have gone up into the trees on the East Coast on the Atlantic Ocean and traveled through the canopy of the trees and never come down on the ground one single time until it came to the Mississippi River halfway across the continent. It was a rainforest. It was a temperate rainforest. Had enormous trees, just like a lot of Australia had in the beginning. There weren't very many people living in those forests. There weren't very many animals in those forests. There wasn't a lot of hunting to be done in those forests. And the people who lived in those forests weren't terribly healthy either, because when they encountered Westerners with diseases they weren't familiar with, they died like flies. Now, as you go west, you get to about the middle of the continent and the rainfall starts to decline. And as you're going west, there's this big mountain range called the Rockies, and the prevailing winds come from the west over the Rockies, and that blocks the rainfall. So as you get closer and closer to the Rocky Mountains, you have less and less rain. So Close to the Mississippi River, there's a lot of rain. Everything is nice and green. The grass, that natural grasses grow there, grow 2 meters tall. There's no animals, very few. You plow that under and you find that that land is growing good corn. Corn has very little protein. It's rather low in nutrients. It's not the best food by any means. It's carbohydrate-rich food. Okay, and there's not many animals there. Protein is what they need, and there's not much protein there. There's very little food in the forest. And the only thing edible in the forest are the leaves of the trees, and most of them aren't digestible. Okay? There's very few minerals in the floor of the forest. They're all locked in the leaves of the trees and the bark and the biomass, and it's recycled as the stuff rots in there, but there's very little. You take very much of it away, and there's nothing to replace it. So as you go further west and you plow, the grass gets shorter and shorter. As you get closer and closer to the Rockies by hundreds of miles, the grass gets shorter and skimpier and less impressive, and there are more and more animals. Until you get out to the place where most of the grass is only, you know, a foot tall, 18 inches tall at best, and it's skimpy, and there's lots of missing bits where you see bare soil. And that's where you've got megatons of buffalo walking around, and antelope and deer, and it's full of mammalian biomass because there's a lot of nutrition in that food because the soils are not leached. So today, if you were to go out where the grass got to be 2 or 3 feet tall and you grow wheat, you come out with wheat that's 12, 13, maybe 14% protein. And if you keep going west and where the grass gets skimpier and skimpier, natural, and the soil gets less and less leaching, you can grow wheat that's 18 and 19% protein. Albrecht will show you in his book maps by the county, by council district in the wheat belt, and the average protein content of the wheat in each council district. And you can just see the pattern as you get into lower and lower rainfall. Oh, he's got maps of rainfall too. So he's helping you correlate all these different factors and come to understand how the climate is affecting the nutritional value of the food. So he saw that. And then he got a piece of data. In 1940, the American government began preparing for entry into the Second World War. They lied, of course, and they told everybody they wanted peace and they were never going to get in the war, but they also instituted a conscription. And in 1940, every young man between the ages of 17 and a half and 26 had to report to the conscription office and have a medical examination to determine their fitness for military service. What an amazing database. Every man in the entire United States, council by council district, county by county, and we know what their health situation was. Now, the state of Missouri, where Albrecht lived, is located on the Mississippi River, and west of it, it's a big rectangle. And in the southeast corner of the state of Missouri, they get 80 inches of rain every year. In the northwest corner of the state of Missouri, they get 20 inches of rain every year. You're getting out into that short grass area as you get that far west. In the middle of Missouri, it's in the middle. So Albrecht brought into his research center hay, just ordinary hay, from northwest Missouri, from central Missouri, and from southeast Missouri. And he got 100 bunnies, and he fed 100 bunnies on each of those different kind of hays for 3 generations. It was really interesting what happened. The bunnies that were put on the hay from southeast got smaller, shorter lived. Their livers looked terrible when they were slaughtered. They had a lot of disease problems. The rabbits that were on the northwest Missouri hay got considerably bigger than they started out as. They were extremely healthy, had perfect litters, had lots of babies. And the ones in this middle of Missouri got that hay, were kind of in the middle. This is not the only experiment of this type that was done. I could take a half an hour and I could tell you about rat studies and cat studies that demonstrate the same thing in various ways. Oh, and I didn't tell you one bit. I remember I talk off the cuff and I tend to forget things. This draft, in the northwest corner of Missouri, 200 young men for 1,000 were unfit for military service. In the southeast corner of Missouri, 400 young men per 1,000 were unfit for military service. And in the middle of Missouri, 300 men per 1,000 were unfit for military service. And I remind you that in 1940, most of the food that most people ate came from within 50 miles of where they lived. So their health was actually reflecting the soil that they were eating from. That's no longer the case. Today, our food comes from everywhere. And if anything saves us from the poverty of our food, it's the fact that it comes from everywhere. And so it kind of creates a more opportunity to get a little bit of this from that soil, a little bit of this from that soil. If it all came from exactly the same place, we might end up like I was when I was eating all vegetables off my trial ground and my health was falling apart. Okay. So anyway, Albrecht looked at all that, and eventually he was able to say, and the very last thing that he ever published, and he paid for it to be lodged in the Library of Congress where nobody could ever make it disappear, because he knew there were a lot of people that wanted this information to disappear. Anyway, he said that if you load up the exchange capacity of the soil so that 68% of it is occupied by calcium, 12% by magnesium, 4% by potassium, and 2% by sodium, that you will get the most nutrient-dense food generally that you can possibly get. How do you do that? Well, you do a soil test, and you send some soil to the lab, and then the lab tells you that the soil has this much exchange capacity, and this percentage of it is occupied by calcium, and this percent by magnesium. And then if you're a soil analyst, you do a little arithmetic, and you can say, okay, well, then I got to add this much calcium to bring it up to 68%. And this much potassium to bring it up to 4%. Okay. Now, what Albrecht didn't deal with was the trace elements. Soil testing in 1965, 1960, was not up to routinely analyzing the trace element levels in soil. It could be done, but it was very tedious. It had to do with reagents and looking at color matching charts, and it was slow and tedious and expensive and not super accurate. So he wasn't really able to say how much copper, how much zinc, how much boron, how much iron, how much manganese, how much molybdenum, how much selenium, how much cobalt. He couldn't say those kind of things because there was no practical way to measure them in that time. Now there is. And so the people who put on Albrecht's boots as soil analysts and tried to walk in his footsteps gradually worked out what they considered to be appropriate targets for trace elements. And that word target's important. See, we have to know a target. If you're a soil analyst, you got to aim at something. There's a wonderful movie that Mel Gibson made. Maybe some of you saw it. It was about the American Revolution. No? And Mel Gibson plays a guy who, he had a little farm in America, in the colonies at the time of the revolt against the British. And there was an atrocity, and a platoon, about 10 or 12 British soldiers, came to his farm and killed his wife. So he and his two sons, they were, I think, like maybe 14 and 16 or something like that, went out after them. And the two boys had their squirrel rifles. That's kind of like a black powder 22. And he had a rifle, and he set the boys up on a hillside, and they set up an ambush. And he looks at his sons and he says, now remember, boys, aim small, miss small. You aim at the button on the guy's shirt, not at his chest. And if you miss, you only miss by a little bit. Okay? Well, in the same way, if you're working with soil, you got to have a target. You have to know where you want to go. And then you can work out how to get there. And we never quite actually get there. Plus or minus 10% is a really good result. And nutrients have an amazing ability to disappear. You put them in and you say, oh, this soil needs this much zinc, and you put it in, and then you do a soil test a year later, and most of it isn't there. It's disappeared. So you do it again. And gradually, slowly, you can bring into shape your soil into the nutrient pattern that you want. Now, we got a pretty good idea right now about how much copper, zinc, boron, manganese, iron, molybdenum that we want to see in a soil. It isn't very much. I mean, we might be talking about oh, 10, 15 kilograms in the furrow slice of a hectare. I see the word furrow slice went by some of you. You have a plow and it flips over the soil about 150 deep. And that layer of soil that the plow turns over is the furrow slice. So in a hectare, a whole acre, 2.2 acres of land, 150 mils deep, that's the furrow slice. And we do most of our soil testing concerning the furrow slice because that's where most of the root activity is. That's where almost all the organic matter is anyway. That's where the plants do most of their feeding, most plants. And so we try to get the furrow slice right. Besides which, you can't practically mix insoluble elements in any deeper than a plow will turn them in. So basically if you had a rotary cultivator that would go 200 mils deep, well, then you could calculate what 200 mils needed instead of 150. But anyway, we're trying to bring that piece of soil into a certain kind of chemical balance. And the easiest way for a gardener to do is to make up something that I call complete organic fertilizer. And I started out using something like that in 1973, 50 years ago. And I was very blessed. I was living in Southern California, and I was reading Organic Gardening magazine, and we had a little business, and we decided to buy a place with some land around it, way out on the edge of Los Angeles, quite cheap. And we put in a big veggie garden, and I read an organic gardening magazine that there was this fellow who was a farm advisor and sold organic fertilizer components, and he lived halfway down to San Diego, hour and a half drive. So I drove down there and I had a chat with him, and he said, "Oh yeah, I know your soil perfectly well. You live in the San Fernando Valley. You need potassium, you need magnesium, you need this stuff here, and you need this, and you need that." He said, "And you put 3 measures of this and 2 measures of this and 1 measure of this together in a bucket, and mix it up and spread it out over a certain area." He said, "And everything will grow great." So I did that, and everything grew great. It was wonderful. I didn't quite understand why, but it did really great. The soils in California don't get hardly any rain at all, and they have a lot of minerals in them. They're heavy with trace elements all by themselves. All I had to really do was put in some potassium and some magnesium and some nitrogen and some phosphorus, and everything just grew great. So I developed that over the years. So in my books, there's a recipe for something called complete organic fertilizer. It's a pretty good guess. It's a one size sort of fits most people who live in a humid climate where there's a fair amount of rainfall. If you lived in a place that had that skimpy short grass that we were talking about that produces the high protein wheat, I would give you a very different fertilizer mix. But for you folks around Geelong, the complete organic fertilizer recipe I have in my book works really good. If you don't have a copy of my book, I'll bet you that Emily would be happy to photocopy the page that has the recipe on it. There's actually 2 recipes in my book right now. One of them is for heavier soil, and one of them is for very poor sand, so soil that won't hold any plant nutrients at all. And the one for sand is more complex. It has more stuff in it, but less of it, and you use it more often because the sand won't hold on to anything. Anyway, with one of these 2 recipes, I think you'd grow food that approached as much nutrient density as it could have. It wouldn't be perfect. To get perfect, you got to do a test. You have to have somebody write you a bespoke fertilizer recipe that exactly matches the missing bits in your soil. And that's quicker, and it does a little better. And if you're dealing with a lot of land, then it will save you a lot of money. I mean, the soil test will cost nothing compared to the amount of fertilizer you won't put in because it doesn't need it. And you will put in what it really does need in the quantities that will really do the job for you. When I make a one-size-fits-all recipe, you see, I don't know. What if your soil already has a fair amount of copper in it? Do I want to put in any? Well, most people's soil doesn't have any copper, so what do I do? Well, I put in just enough copper so that the plants won't be real deficient in copper and the level will slowly build up. But if you've got a lot in there already, it isn't so much it's going to poison anything. It's a really hard call to do that. At what point does it make sense to get a soil test and really try to fine tune your racehorse and make it really grow? Well, I think it depends on what percentage of the food you're growing. If your garden is a couple of stock watering tanks in the backyard filled with sort of landscaped yard growing medium, which is mostly compost and builder sand, and they tell you is soil, and you're producing 4 or 5% of your family's year-round food intake from that, does it matter whether it's real nutritious or not? No, not a bit. It's a nice little hobby and it produces you a bit of good tasting food. And a lot of the reason maybe it tastes better is because it's fresh. It may not really be much more nutritious, if you don't fertilize it well. But so if you use complete organic fertilizer on something like this, it'll make sure that it has all the basics covered. The food will probably taste considerably better. It will grow really well. It won't be as nutrient dense as it could be, but that's all right. It's better, tastes better. Now you get to the point where you start producing a third or more of your family's food intake. Now it starts to really make a difference to how healthy you're going to be. I'm sorry that I don't like to take photographs. I should be running a slideshow here with a little tiny face in the corner, and you look at my pictures, but I just don't do that. But I can tell you this, that I'm 80, be 81, Annie's 83. We don't eat as much as we used to. We're increasingly avoiding carbohydrates and eating a whole lot more greens and meat. I'm living on maybe I'm going to brag. 3 years ago, Annie and I sold a very nice suburban house in an upscale neighborhood in north of Launceston in a place called Grindelwald. If any of you ever come to Tassie and visited, the tourists always go there. It's a sort of Wally World, artificial community that's built in the Swiss style. And most of the older houses in the Grindelwald are on 1 or 2 hectare, and they're all big by covenant. And they're all built in a certain way, and they have to have certain features. And then over the years, they allowed smaller blocks and smaller houses and more modest. And eventually, by the time I came along looking to build a retirement home, I could afford to buy a 1/4-acre block and built a nice little house. And then Annie came along and decided that I looked really good to her, and she was a gardener. And you know how you women are. When you decide you want a man, why oftentimes the guy doesn't have much choice. So anyway, Annie became Mrs. Solomon, and we then bought a vacant 1/4-acre block adjacent. And so we were gardening food on a full 1/4-acre block, and the land around the house, which was sunny, and there was maybe 3/8 of an acre of usable land on the 1/4-acre block. Anyhow, Annie grew fruit trees and flowers and roses and stuff on that. So we had a 1/4-acre of vegetables. You know what we ended up doing? We ran a fruit stand. We produced enormous amount of food. You don't need a 1/4-acre garden. Nah. Our garden right now is 11 beds of 10 square meters each, and 5 apple trees, and 1 more 10 square meter bed growing asparagus, and a polytunnel. Not a real big polytunnel. So the polytunnel produces all the tomatoes and peppers and eggplants and zucchini and cucumbers and chilies, the capsicums that we have any use for, more than we have any use for. And the rest of the land produces more food than we can eat. And I'm constantly giving away things to my neighbors and friends. So is there anybody that I'm looking at in there that's got more than 100 square meters of actual growing bed? I see a hand going up in the back. Very good. Only one. When I went into the seed business in the United States in 1980, I got, kind of connected in the gardening world, and I was buying subscriber lists for magazines to send catalogs to. In those days, there was no internet. In those days, you printed a catalog on paper and took a chance and sent it to somebody. And then maybe they bought something from you by mail. So anyway, I learned at that time that the average American backyard vegetable garden was 1,000 square feet, or roughly 100 square meters. That was average. Now, all right. I hadn't wanted to go here, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about politics. Trying to avoid that subject. But there's a lot going on right now. And you've all been through a serious trauma in Victoria in the last few years. Serious. And it seems like it's over now, but maybe it's just the next one hasn't arrived yet. And I don't mean that there'll be another test tube opened at some biological research lab. I'm talking about something different. Anyway, things may get very difficult. And if you grow your own food, it's maybe better, and maybe it isn't. If you live in the suburbs, the problem is who's going to end up harvesting your food that you grew. And you stay awake 24 hours a day, 7 days a week with a shotgun and guard your farm? No. So the only way that in difficult times that we're going to be able to eat well is if we can get all of our neighbors to grow gardens too. We have to encourage everyone around us to be as self-sufficient as they can be. And before 1974, in Australia and in the United States, gardening was done in a sort of style. It was what we call traditional style. The plants were put in single rows. The rows had walkways between the rows. The rows could be, the distance between the rows would vary depending on the rainfall situation. If your plants had to go through long periods without any rain and you didn't have any irrigation to speak of, you put your rows real far apart. So the plants had a lot of soil to mine for water. And then to the degree that you could add water, you could put the plants close together. Most in the eastern United States, there's enough summer rainfall to keep the land green in the summertime, well, pretty much. And so the rows were usually about, 900 mils apart. You go out further where the rainfall was lower, they'd go 1,200 mils apart. I've read some old books about gardening in Australia. They use exactly the same method, and the rows were 1,200 mils apart. I knew a lady when I first came to Tasmania who grew up in a little town called Exeter on a half-acre block, and she was born in 1935. In 1940 in Exeter, her dad was away in the military. Anyway, in the 40s in Exeter, there was no mains water. There was no sewerage. There was electricity. Tasmania wasn't that primitive. The average building block in most small towns in those days was a half acre. So most of the back of the half acre was a food garden in single rows. Let me tell you how they did it. They didn't know anything about growing nutrient-dense food. All they knew about is they needed to get some food. So there's no sewerage. There's no mains water. I see a lot of faces in there probably know what a dunny is. Yeah? Somebody shake yes? You don't know about a dunny? Maybe they didn't have this in Victoria. Maybe, I've only been here since 1997. I have a lot to learn about Australia. But I'll tell you, in Tasmania, what a dunny is a tin can that holds about 15 liters. It's square, rectangular thing. It used to have oil in it, probably from a fryer restaurant, fast food takeaway place. And you pee in it and you poop in it. And because it's odorous, you don't want it in the house. So there's a little building that's put out the back door of the house that's just big enough for a human being to get in and squat, and it's called the dunny. And in the dunny is the dunny. And when the dunny gets pretty close to full, you got to empty it. So the garden had rows in it 4 feet apart. So you go in between the two rows and you dig a little ditch and you empty the dunny into the ditch and you cover it with soil. And then you gradually work your way down the row, emptying the dunny, one dunny can at a time, until by the end of the year, all the inner row spaces have got a load of dunny waste. And then next spring, you shift all your vegetables over half a step, and now you grow the vegetables where the dunny was emptied, and you empty the dunny where the vegetables grew last year. And they went up on the hillside. They rented and adjusted a dairy cow on a couple acres across the road. And I remember Muriel, as a job, she had to go up there with a big Hessian sack and gather cow pats. And they made compost, and that's how they grew the vegetables. Oh, and water. They didn't have any water. They had I don't know, a 1,000-liter water tank sitting on a platform right outside the kitchen window. And the bottom of the tank was up high enough that by gravity, the water would flow out of the bottom of the tank and into the kitchen sink. So they had a valve, a little tap, and they could drain the tank into the kitchen sink. And that was the household water supply. And then washed once a week, you got a bunch of water and you heated it up and everybody took a bath. And I don't know how they worked out who had to have the last bath every week, but they all used the same water. And every bit of that water was precious. The water that washed dishes was precious. It was taken out to the garden and given to some important plant, which is how people found out that soapy water kills aphids. So that's what they did. And they had food. But it wasn't so good because Muriel had 2 children, and her oldest child was so deficient in iodine that she was mentally, what would you call it, not properly developed and very slow. I met her. You know, she can change her sheets now and dress herself, and sort of look after herself basically. And she's on a pension. That was a nutritional problem. A lot of nutritional problems like that. So anyway, I'd like to see you do a whole lot better than that. And I just got a note from, oh, that was Linda says I need to log off now. I thought it was you, Emily, telling me I talked too long and I had to quit. But it is, I see on the back of the room, 8:30. And I've probably talked long enough. So I'll sum it all up in 1 minute. Please go to the Soil and Health Library, soilandhealth.org, and mouse around there and find some very interesting books to read. You'll find William Albrecht's Soil Fertility and Animal Health. You'll find Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. I could send you a reading list of 30 or 40 titles that would give you a undergraduate degree in radical agriculture. I'd like to see you do that. Please get yourself some complete organic fertilizer. There's a fellow has a seed business not too far from you, and he actually had some of my fertilizer recipe made up, and he sells it by the 25 kg sack. It's made up in an unusual way. It's maybe even better than anything you can make yourself because it's made in a base of composted leonardite coal. So half of the bag is fossilized humus. And when you put it in the soil, it greatly increases the soil's ability to hold on to plant nutrients. It's a miracle for sandy soil. Anyway, do something to get your mineral balance. Get some trace minerals into your soil. Make your garden bigger, please. Ask yourself, how much of your food could you grow? Take a look at making your diet substantially living plant material, chlorophyll. We don't need to eat as much meat as people eat. Oh, I think meat's good food. Don't get me wrong. I'm a vegetabilitarian, not a vegetarian, not a vegan, and somebody who eats mostly vegetables most of the time. That's all. But I eat almost anything. And but chlorophyll, green leaves, are just as good a protein as a beefsteak, and much more digestible, and leave you feeling better. The human body needs about 100 grams of animal protein a week That would supply all those special things you can't get from anything else except animal food. That's all it would take. You could eat 100 grams a day too if you want. But and I'm not even sure about meat anymore. I met a guy who's a carnivore. He doesn't eat anything but meat, and he's incredibly healthy. He believes in it, you know. So maybe there's more to it than I know. So thank you for your attention, and I now stand ready to answer questions as long as you've got them. Over to you, Emily.
Well, thank you so much, Steve. That was fantastic listening. Does anyone have questions for Steve? Goshen's question is, if you're on clay soil and you have chickens and you make your own compost out of things that you grow in your soil, what are the main nutrients that you might be missing?
Right. That's a very good question, and I don't know that I can answer it exactly the way you'd like to hear it. See, I don't have any soil test results on your clay soil. So I'll make you an offer. You get a complete soil test from SWEP, for example. That's in Victoria, SWEP. And you send me the results. They give it to you by email. And I will interpret it for you at no charge. And I'll tell you what to put in your clay soil. Okay. And I'll do that one time for you. And generally, I can write a prescription that's good for 3 years. And after that, if you haven't read my book, The Intelligent Gardener, I probably won't be interested in helping you anymore. But I'm getting old. But anyway, I don't also know exactly what the soils in southern Victoria are generally deficient in. I can tell you that Tasmanian soils are always short boron and copper and usually zinc. And they got plenty of manganese and they got plenty of iron, and they're kind of low in potassium and sometimes rather catastrophic in phosphorus. Okay, I can tell you that. And they need a certain amount of lime because they get leached, and so you have to put a certain amount of lime in here. I think we get more rainfall here than you do in Victoria. I think our rocks are somewhat different. So the answer is I really can't answer that question without seeing a soil test. But I can tell you this about chickens. So be warned, and don't say nobody told you. Okay. I've looked at hundreds of soil tests for gardeners, mostly in Tasmania. I run a service here for gardeners for $50. It used to be 30, but with the inflation that we've been seeing in the last few years, everybody's raised their prices to me, from the post office to the lab that I use. So I have to charge 50 now. So for $50, you can send me a soil sample that you take, and I will send it to my laboratory that I use in Ohio in the United States. And it's a wholesale lab. And they charge me about $25 a sample to do the test. And there's about $4 in postage, and that leaves me with about $20 for my trouble and the time that I'm going to put in. And I'm happy with that. Anyway, I've seen hundreds of soil test results, and every once in a while, I get a soil that's massively overdosed with phosphorus and with zinc, and has a fairly good organic matter content, about 7, 8, 9%. And then I query the gardener, and I say, "Do you use a lot of chicken manure?" And the gardener always says, "Yes. I use nothing but dynamic lifter for the last 15 years. Or I got chickens and I make compost out of their poo and wood and their bedding, and that's what I feed my garden." There's something about chicken food that, see, a plant will concentrate most of the phosphorus that it picks up in its entire lifetime into the seeds. So the seed then has the important nutrition to get the new seedling going. And that seed has to have enough food in it that it will grow a complete plant from a dormant embryo to the point that it has a true leaf, not to the point that it has those 2 little leaves that are thick and fat. Those are called cotyledons. And those actually hold the food that was in storage inside the seed. And then that's used to supply the plant with food until it manufactures a leaf, a real leaf. And from that point on, it can use sunlight to make the sugar that it needs, and it can grow on its own current account, you could say. But until it gets to the point that it can run on the current account, it has to run on savings, and the savings are in the seed coat. So plants tend to concentrate a lot of phosphorus into their seeds. And so when you've got an animal that's fed phosphorus rich food, it manages to take some of it out for its own purposes, but it excretes most of it back into the manure. So chook poo is very rich in phosphorus. And I don't know where the zinc comes from, but there just seems to be a lot of zinc in it. And I don't know why. But so you build up really high levels of phosphorus and zinc, much higher than you want, and they actually will interfere with the plant's ability to take in nutrients. And so you can create soil deficiencies by creating excesses. There's one soil analyst that I pay a lot of attention to. His name is John Kempf. He's brilliant. He's kind of like our own Graham Sate here in Australia. And he's a network of farm advisors, and he does a lot of interesting research. And John, gosh, I lost my train of thought. I'm awfully sorry. Why am I talking about John Kempf? Anyway, I'm sorry, I lost that one. Whatever I was trying to get to, I forgot. Let's get
You
to
were
the next
saying
question.
about chicken manure and too much of some elements will interfere with others.
That's right. Yeah, maybe I made my point already and didn't realize it. Uh,
I should just point out that Steve analyzed my soil in my garden and found that I had heaps and heaps of nearly all the nutrients except calcium. And so my soil is really heavy clay. And how many people here have really heavy clay soil? There's a dividing line somewhere in Geelong. Okay, so it's like half the room?
right. Do you think we could assume that their clay soil is sort of like yours was?
Probably.
If you're gardening and for been a while and you've never put lime in the soil, and you have clay, and let's assume that soil is mostly clay, you could probably put 3 tons of lime to the acre in without running any risk of overdosing the soil. That might only be a half or a third as much lime as it could actually like to have. With lime, if you put in more than 4 tons of lime to the acre and dig it in, what happens is the chemical reaction that's created by all that calcium responding to the acids in the soil completely disrupts the soil, and nothing will grow right for quite a few months. So generally, 4 tons of lime to the acre is the maximum amount of lime you can till in. And if you're spreading it on the surface, you got a paddock, for example, not that this applies to you directly, but if you're doing that, 2 tons to the acre is it. Even if the soil needs 8 tons to the acre, you can't spread more than 2, because if you do, the pH of the surface inch gets so high that the lime won't dissolve. Limestone
Steve,
is
what does that work out
interesting
to on
in
a
this
like a
respect.
grams per square meter?
In grams per square meter, well, let's see, 2 tons of lime would be 2,000 grams per 10 square meters, 200 grams per square meter. Anyway.
Any other questions for Steve? Sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. I
Any
could
other
go on about
questions for Steve?
calcium and lime for half an hour here.
David was asking who produces the COF, the complete organic fertilizer. It's Birdland Seeds.
Yeah, actually, I will answer that question a little bit more thoroughly for you. I don't think Ben would mind if I gave away his trade secrets. There's a company called Hybrid Ag, and they're in Wangaratta, and they're not too far away from the soft coal deposits. And they make a very interesting line of fertilizers that are entirely bespoke. You send them a soil test, you work out what you want to put in, then they mix up a product for you that has all those elements, but 50% of the bag is composted soft brown coal. And so then what happens is and they use chemical fertilizer, but the way they do it, it doesn't cause any harm in the soil, because everything in the fertilizer goes in and attaches itself to the exchange points on the coal. And so it's kind of like, you could look on soft brown coal as fossilized humus, and you're putting humus into the soil that's got nutrients on it. And then after the plants have used all the nutrients, the humus is still there. So you've increased your ability of your soil to hold on to plant nutrients by half a bag of fertilizer every time you use a bag. So it's wonderful stuff. And it doesn't really cost any more than if you got the ingredients as I recommend it, and made it up of stuff you can get from the farm supply. Okay, I'm done.
There's one more question here we have a regenerative farmer in the audience, and he was talking about a company called Munash who gave him a bespoke mix of lime and trace elements, and he found that the species of plants growing on the farm completely changed after he added that.
I bet they would. Yeah. Yeah, I've seen that in my own paddocks too. Annie and I, 3 years ago, I got started in this. I don't think I finished. We ended up buying an 11-acre property in Chudley. And Chudley, as the locals say here, is 3 blankets colder in the winter than where I used to live. And it's pretty remote. And we're sitting right up against the Central Highlands. Not real high elevation, but let me tell you, when the wind starts blowing from the south over the Central Highlands, we can get 160 kph wind gusts here in Chudley. And it can get pretty wild here. We get a lot of weather in Chudley. Yeah, anyway, I have noticed that after I fertilized one of my paddocks with trace elements and all that stuff, that the whole vegetation mix on the paddock changed. Yeah, and the cow, this was a dairy paddock. For a while we were milking. We had some neighbors actually that kept their dairy cow on our property and gave us whatever milk we wanted, which wasn't that much. And the cow, after I fertilized that soil, the cow got shiny. I don't know how to put it. And she was just frisky and felt really good. So anyway, it's good that you understand that. Yeah.
I should also point out that Steve's book, The Intelligent Gardener, teaches you how to analyze a soil test and calculate your own, calculate what your garden needs.
Yeah.
However, soil tests in Australia tend to, like if you send it to a local lab here in Australia, they'll charge you like $200 for the soil test. But you can use Steve's service where he'll send it to the USA and figure out all the import restrictions and things and give you advice for way less.
Right. Let me say 2 things about that so they understand the whole situation. You're welcome to send me a soil sample. If you do it, put it in one of those little pink parcel post pouches and do not say anything on the outside about soil, because you're not allowed to send soil to Tasmania. Okay, you might have some horrible thing there, and our biosecurity will not allow it in. So if that is a concern to you, you can send it to a local lab. Now, there's a lab in Tasmania called AgVita, AGVITA, and they charge $100. And they're a very good lab. Okay. And the lab I use charges 25 US. What is that, around $40 now? Something like that, Aussie. And they're just as accurate, but it can take me more than 3 weeks before I get a result for you. So if you were in a hurry, you would not want to use my services. But I'll still be happy to analyze it for you. For me to look at a soil test and tell you what to do from it takes me 10 minutes. It's not a big deal. It takes longer to write it down than it is for me to figure it out.
Okay, we've got one other question. Yeah. Nina was just thanking you, Steve, and thanking the audience. And let me add my thanks as well. It was wonderful to have you with us and share your knowledge. And really appreciate you giving us your time tonight. Thank you so much, Steve.
You're very welcome. And this has been actually very enjoyable for me. This is the first time thank you. This is the first time I've ever had an interactive Zoom conference. Maybe we'll be doing more of this. Okay. Anyway, so are we done? I can just sign off?
Yes. Thank you so much, Steve. See you next
Goodbye.
time.
All the best.
Bye.